I was simply going to finish up by saying that parts of these issues that are being taken up may serve as a great segue, but the Higher Ed Coordinating Council is taking up these very issues so that regardless of where a student comes from via delivery system, there'll be a clearer pathway toward their level of education and accessibility to a job. And this gets back to the issue of STEM. There's a chicken or the egg sort of a scenario revolving around STEM. There's a clear desire to produce more STEM-educated people. We all know that. But at the end of the day, if we're going to relate it to Florida, we've got to more finely tune that desire to increase STEM to what kind of STEM. Because again, if we don't have, and I'm relating this to Florida now, not the national trends, that's important too, but to specifically Florida, you have to have enough jobs in those STEM-related areas to make it worthwhile not only to get that STEM degree, but then to stay in Florida and be able to apply the trade that we've trained you for. Doesn't mean you can't go off to Boston or to California. We're not trying to hold people hostage, but at the end of the day, it is about balancing the supply, the talent supply chain, and the work portfolio to make sure that to the greatest degree possible, Florida is producing students to do jobs in Florida. The nation and the world, yes, but also in Florida. That's the whole idea of creating that knowledge-based economy that we all want to see.
Dr. Hodges, thank you. I very much appreciate your work. Dr. Harrington, thank you as well. I think we'll be back. We'll be back to you. We
thank you, sir.
It does serve as a segue into our next matter, which is a report on the Higher Education Coordinating Council. Marshall Kreiser's here, who's the co-chair of the council and is a great friend of higher education and education in general. So, Marshall, and I'm going to turn it over to Frank to introduce this matter.
Well, Marshall will do a great job of explanation, but just to remind everybody for historic sake, the Higher Ed Coordinating Council was placed into law just a couple of years ago, and it is representative of the 5 different education delivery systems. 2 of us are on that council who are seated here today. Commissioner Robinson representing pre-K through 12, as well as in his role all of the other components of that entity. The Chancellor of the State College System, the Chancellor of the State University System, and the 2 representatives of the private providers, the ICUF schools and the for-profit schools. And then we have 2 members at large, one given to us by the House, one given to us by the Senate. They are John Moyle and obviously Marshall Kreiser. Marshall serves as our current chair of the Higher Ed Coordinating Council. We thought it was timely to come before you on this subject today. He was kind enough to provide us his time to be able to personalize it for you. You all received over the last couple of months draft copies and then final copy of the work that has been done by the Higher Ed Coordinating Council, comprised of a good number of recommendations put on the table by this cross-representative group, and then some statutory required issues that we have dealt with since our last legislative session. So by way of that, Mr. Chairman, with your approval, I will turn it over to Chair Kreiser.
Chairman, Governors, Chancellor, I appreciate the time this morning. I will confess to you, I actually thought I was going to follow a presentation by the Chancellor, and so I cut all of my remarks in half. I also wanted to reserve a little bit of time right at the end of I want to deal with some cardboard up here before I'm done today, so I will try to keep this fairly brief. I do, though, as I look across the room, Mikey, I heard an announcement yesterday, and I just have to tell you personally, I think that the contribution you've made to this body and to the state of Florida is one that we ought to be continuing to recognize. So I'm sorry I did not let you off the hook on only one day, but congratulations, but I think it's condolences to all the rest of us. And he's better for it. What I would like to do quickly is, and I think they've given me control, and they have, a couple of quick things, a little bit of background, and I'm not going to read slides to you or try to take you through all the details, but I think the critical issue here is that in 2010, the legislature challenged the combination of the sectors involved in education as well as the business community to quit talking about doing things differently or thinking about what it needed to be done differently, and actually engage in a conversation and move the ball forward and attempt to better define areas where we could coordinate, resolve problems, resolve conflict, and if possible, and do that by making recommendations to the bodies and boards who have the governing authority over the various sectors, both in the higher education space, but also recognizing the interrelationship between higher education and what goes on in the voluntary pre-K through 12 arena. And so as a result of that, we were brought around the table in 2010, and then with some direction in 2011, very specifically from the legislature, on questions that they wanted us to address in terms of the mission of the higher education system, in terms of economic development and access. And so I think it's very relevant to talk today about what that charge was in 2011, a little bit about the report that we've just released to the legislature, and then I'll try to tie that into a couple of the questions I heard asked of the previous speaker. I think I can offer some additional information, at least from what the HEC has been looking at. I don't think you'll see anything in our goals that are inconsistent with what your discussion is as you look at higher education. And as we all are talking about teaching and learning, we are talking about scholarship, we're talking about research, we're talking about innovation. We're also talking about the partnerships that can be created amongst the education community, but also among the other communities in the state of Florida, including the business community, and how the synergies in those conversations can lead us to the most productive model possible for the state. I think there's also an interesting piece to all this is, as we walk through this, I tend to use business terms rather than education terms. And so I start thinking about who is the customer. So I don't, and it's actually in some ways helpful in the higher education space, because what we see very quickly is you might quickly say, well, that's the student. And I'm not taking the student out of that dialogue. But we also have to look at who pays for higher education. And what that brings into it is the state. What it brings into it is the taxpayer and the parents. And it brings into the conversation the students. And that's not to suggest that those aren't issues that you already address. But it has been a very powerful context for us to think about who is the customer in relationship also as to, and who is paying for. And I would go back to the prior discussion when you were talking about return on investment. The return on investment to the state may be a different answer than the return on investment to the student, may be a different answer than the return on the investment to the parent. And I think it's possible, however, to look at in combination how those factors play together in order to look at the right public policies that will get us, again, the model that maximizes our capabilities in the state. With that regard, a couple of things that kind of came out of this, and I ought to step back half a step and say, and by the way, when the legislature gave us that challenge, there's a phrase that I'm very fond of in there because it helped us to sculpt and remind ourselves, because it said within existing resources. So the challenge to the Higher Education Coordinating Council was not come back and tell us what you need more money for, or tell us what you would do if you had more money, but find ways to look at the system today and the appropriations today, given the reality of our budgets, and start thinking about ways that we can accomplish some of these initiatives within existing resources. I think one thing that we can look at clearly here, and it's a part of the state conversation, is how do we move toward an outcome and performance-based funding model versus an input model that has been used traditionally in the past. I think this becomes a critical part of that discussion. Chancellor has shared the work that the Board of Governors is doing in looking at performance-based models. The state college system is also looking at accountability and performance-based models. Part of the discussion we'll try to have at the HEC is how do you coordinate and combine those conversations where it's appropriate, so that when you're talking about the same thing, which could be a four-year undergraduate degree, I always say four-year because I try to remind I still have a child who's going to go through the system someday, that undergraduate degrees were intended to be done in 4 years, and it's not a bad thing to think of it that way. But for anyone else, I guess I would just say a baccalaureate degree. How do we continue to look at that and develop models such that we have consistent metrics, consistent language, consistent collaboration among the different sectors, and not just public side, and not just colleges and universities, but publics, privates, colleges, universities, everybody who's involved in this space. We also understand that a lot of folks want to compete for and look at how we do workforce development funding in the state. And again, the model there and several of the recommendations touch on how you align those more closely with outcome-based funding rather than simply funding programs on the front end. The other aspect of this that if I would switch your page when I switch my page, it would help. I apologize. The other aspect of this is we've had a lot of conversation about how to create incentives and measurements around the institutions or the sectors that address education. Yet a lot of the funding in Florida follows the student, and it's done generically. So if we don't start looking at the incentives or disincentives we provide to students when they begin looking at their college choices, their degree choices, we're going to be working against ourselves. At the same time, we have other funding mechanisms that we use, such as advanced placement, dual enrollment, that are intended to offer a student an opportunity to spend less time at a higher education institution. Yet the data would suggest that we're seeing students staying in college, in university, longer than, at least go back to my 4-year mantra, which I was told was the rule way back when I was getting ready to go to college. And so we need to better understand how these different economic elements play and whether or not they're playing against each other and whether or not they can be aligned so that they coordinate and drive together. So creating incentives for universities to have more STEM-related degrees. If there is no incentive for students probably about the 5th grade to start thinking about going into STEM degrees, can end up creating a supply without a demand, at least within respect to what the student looks at and maybe what the state's looking at in terms of how we align this. And so I believe there's a very complicated, realistically complicated, or complex at least, I'll say that sounds better than complicated. Complex can be solved. I think there's a complex discussion that needs to occur about how we're able to align funding and funding decisions and incentivize behavior in such a way that people will still have choice, but there may be incentives for them to choose to do that. And so, for example, we need to look at programs like Bright Futures, like FRAG, like some of the other funding mechanisms that really are not designed so much by what is being taught, but what someone chooses to go and do in terms of higher education. This is kind of a couple of byproducts I wanted to talk about in terms of this conversation, and I believe you have seen some of this data in front of this board before, but we've continued to kind of talk about it and further develop it, and I honestly don't know how much this conversation has gone beyond the bog. A lady by the name of Dottie Minier is really the one who gets the credit for this, and I think you've seen some of the analysis that Dottie did. Rather than, this is in, I believe you will have the material if you wanted to look at the assumptions, but the picture is probably the best thing to look at. Essentially what this looks at is if you take, on the bottom line, our assumptions about what we will have in terms of undergraduate enrollment going forward, and you make a downward adjustment based on the fact that the economy in the last few years is not the economy of the 10 years before that. So we're no longer a state that has 1,100 people every day moving to Florida, and therefore we will have more students, and therefore we will have more high school graduates, and therefore we will still have that. But we've made an assumption, and this is really just to get the conversation kick-started. But even if you adjust down based on slower population growth for your expectations for folks looking at seats somewhere beyond high school, you add to that an assumption about what the initiatives in K through 12 are doing in terms of student performance. Our students in K through 12 are doing better. I believe the data supports that. As a result of doing better, more of them are going to graduate high school. As a result of graduating high school, some percentage of them are going to expect to go on to a college or a university or some other workforce development program that statistical trends wouldn't have shown you in the past. We've raised the bar. And as a result of our students meeting the bar, they're going to raise the bar for us because they're going to have expectations that they're going to expect to have met. On top of that, you've also got national influences. We have programs nationally that are attempting to do this. And so what Dottie began was a conversation about if you start without population growth assumptions, I interpret that to mean no new revenue, no new taxpayers, but more students who will expect to be served by our higher education process. We need to start thinking about how you align the different sectors and the different institutions in order to meet that demand. That's where I believe a lot of this conversation needs to anticipate is the world that we will see in the future as we look at these policies, not necessarily the world where we are today. It's where conversations between the Board of Governors and the State Board of Education become very critical to looking at how four-year degrees are coordinated, calculated, financed, conducted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is looking at the need to do that. I think it also underscores the need, watched all the PICO announcements that we've seen recently in terms of where PICO budget is today. I think the reality is we have to be very mindful as we look at that process is how can you use different technologies, different modes, different alignments, different coordination processes to accomplish that, short of always saying, well, the next 100,000 gets this many more buildings built. We're going to have to be thinking about how we create the capacity in the system. And again, hopefully we will do this in a growing economy. But I don't think we can afford to ignore it if we don't get the growth in the economy, because I think that the growth in student success is absolutely going to set an expectation on the system in the future that we are in a position right now to really evaluate and be prepared for. Another one of our, in business you say things like byproduct, and it just doesn't sound very sexy. But let me say a return on investment is a better way to frame this. And Governor Tripp, you asked a question about, has anybody sat down and said, okay, so we're creating all these students, where's the job need? There's really sort of a two-part process that the HEC has been engaged in. We started looking at the supply side. What we were looking at within the HEC, and I think I saw Richard Stevens in the room somewhere earlier. Richard's here, so I shouldn't say we. What happened was Richard Stevens went out and began working with all of the other folks that were engaged in this process. Florida has now developed what we have called Florida Talent Net. What we have sat down and figured out is what programs are offered in Florida by all of the institutions, public and private, colleges and universities, so that we have an inventory that can be looked at for governing purposes, for policy-making purposes, but where the little light bulb went off for me, this is also a model we've shared with Enterprise Florida and with the Office of the Development and Economic, DEO, sorry, I have to fall back on the acronym. But essentially working with the economic developers in the state, because this becomes a tool where whether you're looking at this from a governance model or you're looking from this as a corporate model, trying to understand where in Florida you can go that they teach the types of skills and knowledge that you may need as an employer, or simply because we are the first state to do this. You distinguish Florida by saying we are a state that looks at our talent supply, and we want to offer you the opportunity to look and see what resources we have. It can also be helpful in understanding if we've got a supply that's kind of matching demand. The parallel path to this is Workforce Florida is engaged right now in working on a talent needs summary. Both of these are going to be dynamic models. This model needs to constantly be updated to reflect the types of programs and degrees that are offered in the state. That model is going to be, frankly, even more interesting to develop how you maintain and update it. Because what you're looking at is not a snapshot today that defines the workforce of Florida for the next 20 years. I think in many ways you have the opportunity to begin a process of constantly defining and adjusting what are the workforce needs in Florida. And essentially, like anything you may try to do, if we see if we have a shortage in a certain area, resources are going to move in that area at some level. If the publics don't do it, the privates will. They're incredibly good at arbitraging places where the public system doesn't do isn't meeting a specific demand. And so what you're going to see is we may see shifts back and forth, but over time we may also see, what is the technology or what is the industry that's going to come or be looking for a place to locate in 10 to 15 years. But with a dynamic model like this, I think we have the opportunity to do a better conversation on around exactly what it is we're trying to accomplish, how we match supply and demand in the state, and through, as a result of that, I think some of the other decisions around what performance and what outcomes you want to achieve, and I guess maybe end on that point, I think, is it's going to be absolutely critical that we first identify what is it we want to achieve. Then we will be able to calculate what the return on investment is, because we'll be able to establish the priorities that we want to do that will hopefully give you all the tool and give the State Board of Education the tool to have a conversation about how we look at programs and how we look at funding and how we look at finance needs in the future. I think with that I would, I would add, and in the material, I won't walk through it just to keep the time short. In the materials that we've submitted, we made recommendations again in this report to the legislature. We have now gone through and parsed those out. So with all due respect, we made recommendations to the Board of Governors. We made recommendations to the State Board of Education. We've made recommendations to the legislature. We have tried now to go through those and separate out exactly sort of where those recommendations were aligned. We are working on, and then, so what happens? So that this doesn't become, you know, the report they did back in 2011 and no one's looked at it for the last few years. I'll go off on a side note with that. I would add to this, the exercise we did earlier this month, we went back to the report you all did in 2007, the Pappas report. We have actually correlated our report now and our recommendations to what Pappas recommended. The really good news out of all that is we have reinforced that some of the things that we have been talking about are still critically important in this state. And what we don't want to do, though, is just be in a process of correlating reports to see if we still are talking about the same problems. I think we're going to try to develop the appropriate way and something meaningful, not something bureaucratic, as a way to keep tabs on this and see how this conversation processes and try to understand essentially what the report card or the dashboard is as we go forward. And with that, the recommendations specific to the Board of Governors are included as an appendix to my presentation, and that's there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Morris. Thank you for your hard work on this, and thank you for taking the time to come and visit with us. First Chancellor, you on the commission?
Yes, sir. I just, first of all, want to note the fact that it's pretty obvious we have great leadership. Marshall has become something of an expert in these areas, I think. He already came to the table extremely knowledgeable because of his longtime participation, but he's really provided, I think, great leadership as we all work together. We meet on a very regular basis, and we meet for long periods of time. These are not rubber stamp meetings. The lion's share of our meetings are meant to do, I know, something this board would always like to do more of, and that's dialogue, talk, and compare problems and issues and potential solutions. You have the document, and I will re-acknowledge something Marshall mentioned, and that is the fact that it includes about 34 recommendations that were created by the different delivery systems. They started, Marshall, I think, at 85, if memory served. We culled and cut and winnowed that down to 34. We now have them categorized by delivery system. We combined some that were cross-delivery system, and those are now available in clean form. You all also note, and it was a good piece of work, the alignment of the Pappas report with those recommendations, which I think can be very helpful to us going forward with the work we have to do, not only individually, but with those other delivery systems, very important. And I will end by saying this. I'm not sure what some people divined would be the net worth of the Higher Ed Coordinating Council when it was created, and I was one of the proponents of it. But from where I sat and what I believed it could accomplish, it is an early success. It's only been 18 months, I think, or a little longer in its creation. But if it did nothing else, it has provided a forum for the different delivery systems to sit down at a table on a regular basis and do, quite frankly, what we should have been doing for decades, and that is talk together, plan together, reconcile together, and look at common issues and those things that should help us align our efforts for the future. And Marshall, thanks for, as always, for your great leadership. And John Moyle, I don't want to leave out of this because he's our other lay representative, and those two provide us a good and steady hand as we move our efforts forward. So, and I also would like to, with your permission, acknowledge again that Commissioner Robinson is a member, and see if he might want to weigh in on the HEC and his early relationship with it.
It's one of the rare opportunities for K-12 and higher education to be at the same table to talk about the handoff from high school to college, or in some instances, high school to the workforce. And so those conversations, frankly, don't happen enough. And so I was glad to be a part of the process. From the K-12 side, it actually helped shape our thinking as we, as Department of Education, with approval from our board, have new achievement scores for both reading and math. And one function we have now is we've identified a number needed for our students to go into the Florida college system without need for remediation. We know that's a major challenge for Florida and other states. So part of the HEC conversation played a role in shaping how we came to that conclusion. So it's a very good process, and I'm glad to be a part of the team.
Great. Board members, any questions? Governor Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Marshall, for taking the opportunity to come and speak with us. And yeah, I kind of have a general question that's not so much related to your report as much as kind of how you see the work of the Higher Education Coordinating Council moving forward. When I think back to when we sat down and kind of went through ways that we could resolve the outstanding lawsuit, and we sat down and developed an agreement with the Florida legislature, I think a part of that, or from that agreement, we developed this Higher Education Coordinating Council that, kind of had, some responsibilities that seem somewhat different from the ones that have been passed off to you all now. And I know that a lot of that came from some legislation that was passed by sponsored by Representative Proctor last session, wherein he wanted this type of kind of cumulative data. So I guess my question is whether you see, based upon your current involvement, the need to continue the type of intense work that the Higher Education Coordinating Council is doing now. It's like, do you see the responsibilities for the council going much further than the production of this document? And second, are there, and you may not know this, but are there any information about the possibility of additional legislation coming out that would further require you guys to even do more or different things?
I think I'd start with, I have no inside knowledge on what the legislature may ask us to do going forward. Clearly in 2011, they sort of helped us frame some very specific conversation. With that said, I think, so where are we going next? That was actually our January meeting. Number one is let's make sure we take what we've said in the report and we have communicated it properly to each of the entities that we are communicating to, so to the legislature, to the Board of Governors, to the State Board of Education. In addition to that, there are certain items that, and it was in my slides, I kind of was trying not to get into them individually, but for example, one of the items that we've discussed is to have what we referred to as a degree estimating conference in Florida, similar to the way the state does a revenue estimating conference, is to create sort of the dynamic dialogue. And the HEC has said, and I would say, frankly, my first reaction would be, and if someone else wants to go do it, that would be a wonderful thing. But if not, then to bring all of the folks that need to be brought to the table to have that conversation. Again, this would bring essentially all the sectors that are represented at the HEC, and so it has some merit to doing it there. Make sure we get that process going and that we understand how it works. There is probably also a list of issues that I don't know that we are trying to create questions that, we do try to think about what are the questions that somebody should be worrying about that we don't think someone's worrying about, and what are the things that we know someone's worrying about and we ought to let them do it. But I do think there is a whole new conversation in the state right now about performance and accountability and how do we define a model, and I think that we need to look at that in terms of its impacts across the different sectors, and we can be there. And then without attribution, I'll just say, and as we talked about our agenda for the year, one of the board members our council members leaned over to me at the last meeting and said, that's fine, but if the legislature asks us to do something specific, we will need to go do that. And so I guess in some ways I would say we will do what we are asked to do, and then we will also try to continue to find the value added. What I we did not do the report because we thought doing a report, and I don't think we were asked to do the report because anybody thought doing a report was a good idea. I think we were asked to do the report so that we could develop a action plan and in this case a set of recommendations, and that we would continue to look at that, talk about that, and understand exactly how that's going to play out. And then there's other issues that I think have come to the table, and we remind ourselves all the time that we've got to think about how not just the higher ed space, but as the chart I put up indicated, it really helps to explain how the continuum that can start as early as if we do something better in voluntary pre-K, then that's going to flow through the system, and at some point it's going to come out in the higher ed space. And if we do something worse anywhere along the line, it's going to come out in the higher ed space. And that's something I think that it's the long-term piece of really understanding how that fits together.
Others? Governor Tripp?
Yes, sir.
I want to say one thing about Marshall, that at an event, he came up to me and said, as a governor, I want you to know that I fully respect the fact that I was appointed by you to the Board of Trustees of the University of Florida, and I intend fully to make sure that we always work together and that our interests are aligned in the fact that we're all serving the state of Florida. Very impressed by that, and I thank you. My question is, are we any closer to coming to a path where we make sure that access in the now called state college system, former community college system, and the 2+2 are on a solid footing, and that the state has some direction about how we transition from the pure 2-year degree, where the state colleges will be taking on more 4-year degrees, but we continue to keep in place the great system that we had that afforded so many the opportunities.
I would go back to, I think Pappas was probably, the Pappas report really sort of tagged that issue as one of the foundation items that they included. I would say I think that we continue to have a model that other states have tried to emulate in the 2+2 model, and that the conversation about understanding where the friction points are is very alive, and that's a healthy thing. So from that perspective, I think that's very positive. I do think it brings us back to the overall discussion of really understanding exactly what the needs are of the state and what the capacity of the system is to deliver to those needs. And I think it's important for us as we look at that to understand that not every university or every college is a homogeneous unit that does exactly the same that everything else does, and that's actually a good thing. We need to, I think that there is incredible value that can be created in a system where there is the ability to have enough flexibility to really create value, recognize value, incentivize value. And so different players have sort of different roles. I think there's an interesting point probably between defining what aspirational goals are versus true mission within the sectors and within the different institutions, and understanding how those align. And if they're getting to the right place, don't tinker with it, but be cautious that we understand sort of what the outcomes are that we're trying to accomplish in the state. The chart, I think, suggests that there's going to be a greater partnership and collaboration, and I think the universities are doing an incredible job of developing, and I should say the universities and the colleges, because that's the point I wanted to make, are developing great collaborations and great partnerships. And that can be a dynamic factor, because it's a way of understanding how you serve the Florida community. But I think it's an area that, but the real work, I think, is still ahead of us, because we have kind of an open gate system right now that essentially you all look at 4-year degrees from certain places, and someone else is looking at 4-year degrees from other places because of the scope and the definition of what the governing boards are. I think there's a tremendous value when the Board of Governors and the State Board of Education can meet collaboratively and have some level of conversation exactly around, again, comes back to performance and accountability. If we get that right and we get that conversation to be consistent, then we have, I heard the term recently, shared responsibility, and I think it truly is a shared responsibility. And for that, I think there can be some kind of common approach to accountability and performance.
Governor Hussaini, and then we got to keep moving.
Okay. Marshall, Mr. Kreiser, I think our state and our board is blessed to have a person of your quality and dedication to education to have to be with us. I have a question for you. Can you just in a minute or so, tell us about your experience with orientation that you came over at I think at the last board meeting. How do you feel about that?
Fantastic. You know, you can't understand someone's perspective until you have, you know, the old saying is walk in my shoes for a day. I think until you have tried to at least sit around your table for a day, I don't know that anyone understands the challenges that are in front of you. I'd say the same thing about any one of the presidents that are at this table. You know, each of you comes at this with a certain perspective and a certain skill set, and collaboratively you're trying to work yourself through some very difficult issues. And so to me, orientation and ways of building, if the more dialogue there is in our state, I think the stronger we all are, and your orientation program is an example of a very powerful way to do that. I think I noted also you didn't just include or invite the trustees who were appointed by the Board of Governors. I believe there were also trustees were invited who, you know, regardless of their appointment route, and that's a powerful thing as well. We need to understand the issues that are in front of you. We love the opportunity when you visit our campuses to share the issues that are in front of us, and I appreciate the fact not only that you invited me to orientation, but I know today you're here, and I know last year you had a meeting at the University of Florida. Those are the types of things I think make us all stronger.
Thank you.
Marshall, thank you so much for coming today and sharing, and thank you for all the work that you've done on this. It's really, really helpful. Okay. I appreciate it.
If I could take 1 minute, I want to underscore that we talk a lot about collaboration, and I'll sort of actually make this as a presentation, but I also want to make it as a challenge. And I'm making the challenge not to you all, but actually to the business community in the state of Florida. We've had the opportunity at AT&T through the National Science and Math Initiative to be able to support some very powerful programs around the country. They arose out of a program designed at the University of Texas at Austin called UTeach, or UT-Teach, I believe they originally called it. And in that program, it was actually looking at this issue that you're talking about, which is how do we get education professionals who have, now we talk a lot about STEM degrees. What about the people who teach those kids in 5th grade who may someday get excited about STEM degrees? And so how do we find people in math and science who are more interested in an education career rather than in a technical career or a business career or something else? And so the model was to start exposing students to education and what the role of an educator could be. What's also interesting about the model is it's not cookie cutter. Each of the universities that has adopted a version of this model actually has a slightly different program, and I'm not an expert on exactly the differences. Presidents Matchin and President Barron could better speak to that than I can. But the bottom line is, in Florida, we are blessed to have 2 of the 5 programs that have built on that original model. And so as a result of some support that AT&T decided to do for the National Science and Math Initiative, I've got the pleasure of being able to present a check to the President of Florida State and to the President of the University of Florida for each university for $100,000 apiece to support the FSU Teach and the UF Teach programs in the state of Florida.
Wonderful.
You want to do it? Yeah, why don't we try it?
No. I thought it looks like they won a golf tournament.
I'm so glad you didn't give him one check and tell him that you all decide how you want to divide it.
Thank you. Folks, I think it's appropriate if we take a 5-minute break now and then hurry back because Chair Parker has told me not to run late. 5 minutes. We got a quorum. All right, let's, the next item on the agenda is the Facilities Committee report. Governor Beard.
Mr. Chairman, we have 2 action items on our Facilities Committee. We have a resolution of the Board of Governors authorizing the Division of Bond Finance of the State Board of Administration of Florida to issue debt on behalf of the University of Florida to finance the construction of student residence on the main campus of the University of Florida. That would be action item number 1.
And that's a motion on your part?
I make the motion.
We have a second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Item passes.
We have a second resolution. This resolution is the Board of Governors incorporating additional housing facilities into the UCF housing system. This was not discussed, but we need to bring it before the board for a motion. So I make the motion.
Okay. A motion second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Motion passes.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Mr.
sir.
Chairman.
Governor Duncan, Academic and Student Affairs Report.
Good morning. I'd like to make a motion to approve amended Board Regulation 6.018, substitution or modification of requirements for program admission, undergraduate transfer, and for the graduation by students with disabilities. This action aligns with the regulations for our 2011 statutory changes to sections 1.007.264 and 1.007.265 Florida statutes. The regulation was first approved for public notice at the November 11 meeting and is now ready for final consideration.
Okay, we have a motion. We have a second. So we have a second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passes.
Great. Secondly, we have, I'd like to make a motion to approve amended Board Regulation 8.016 and the title change from Academic Learning Compacts to Student Learning Outcomes Assessments. The amendments to the regulation clarify the purpose related to the Student Learning Outcome Assessment. The regulation was approved for public notice at the November 2011 meeting and is now ready for final consideration.
Good motion. We have a second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Next, I'd like to make a motion to approve approval for implementation of a PhD in environmental engineering at the University of South Florida. The Board of Governors Academic and Student Affairs Committee reviewed and approved this proposal for consideration on November 9th. And if it is approved now, USF will implement the program in spring 12. So we have gone through this pretty thoroughly at the committee level as well.
And you're moving it?
Yes.
We have a second? Second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
The next one I'd like to move approval is for the Florida International University implement a PhD in biomedical sciences. The Board of Governors Academic and Student Affairs Committee reviewed and approved this proposal for consideration on November 9th as well, and would like to move approval.
Second? Is there a second? We have a second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Motion passes.
And then we also have a number of items that were on the consent agenda related to academic and student affairs. I'd like to move approval of those items as well. I don't know, Mikey, do I need to read each of them? Okay. The first is the removal of limited access status for the BS in geomatics at UF. The second is limited access status for the BS in biomedical engineering at UF. The third is a BS in biomedical engineering for UF to exceed the 120 credit hours degree. The next is a BS in elementary education specialization, elementary education, ESOL reading at UWF to exceed 120 hours to degree. The next is a BS in exceptional student education specialization in the student elementary education, ESOL reading at UWF to exceed 120 credit hours to degree. And the last is a BA in liberal arts and sciences at the New College of Florida to exceed the 120 hour to degree.
Do we have a second on these? We have a second. Any discussion? I've had no request for any matters to be taken off the consent agenda, so all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
And then, Mr. Chair, if I could just do two other brief updates from our committee. One, I think President Benz and President Ginshaft were absent yesterday during our discussion on the completer program and the distance learning initiatives we have going. Both of them have put considerable staff effort into it, as have a number of other institutions, but I just wanted to personally thank them, especially Pam Northrup. She has just put in a ton of hours, but both teams have been working well together, and I wanted to thank them. And also on that point, you may be hearing from staff with the chair's consent to think about how do we kind of help get some update and information on distance learning for the dialogue to continue and for us all kind of to have a good solid baseline information. We had a workshop some time ago. I'm not sure that's the right vehicle, so be thinking about that, but you'll probably be hearing from the staff on that point as well.
Great.
Thanks.
Anything further?
Thank you.
Thank you. Governor Martins, strategic planning.
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have one item that we'd like for the board to consider today. At our meeting yesterday, the Strategic Planning Committee approved the annual accountability report. I'd like to commend staff for their work on this report, Jason Jones and Ari Lamont. The report is a little more user-friendly. It has 13 discrete reports, an overall summary, and a report on each one of the 11 universities. It also gives you metrics at a glance. So for a lot of the metrics, you can take a look at one page and see the entire system. So it's a lot more user-friendly than it has been. So at this point, I would ask approval of the 2010-2011 Annual Accountability Report.
Can we have a second? Okay, we have a motion second. Any discussion? This is terrific work, I think, by the committee and the staff. And so, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. Anything further?
That's it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Governor Hussaini, the report on the Select Committee on USF Polytechnic.
Oh, okay. Mr. Chairman, I was going to give you a report first on the nomination, but
Well, you can do that.
can I do that? Can
I just want to move.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, the trustee nominating committee met yesterday to fill the one remaining trustee vacancy, a seat at University of West Florida. The members of the University of West Florida review team, Governor Ann Duncan and Governor Norm Tripp, reviewed applications and conducted interviews. They recommended to the committee for appointment to the University of West Florida Board of Trustees Mrs. Pam Dana. Members of the committee concurred. I move that the board appoint Pam Dana to University of West Florida Board of Trustees in the seat previously held by Mr. Randy Hanna, effective immediately, for term ending January 2016, subject to attending the orientation.
Second. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye.
Would you like me to go to
Yeah.
To more fun?
Whatever order you want to go in.
more fun? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our committee was mandated with a very narrow mandate of working with University of South Florida to hopefully move Polytech to become the 12th university. Many people on our board, outside, legislators, and people in the state, some for, some against. At the end of the day, this board decided that to go forward with a criteria, very clear criteria set in place that to move forward and hopefully for us to have a politic, independent, and I believe, again, you know, some could be for, some could be against, that at the end of the day, we may have a new formula for us to create a politic that would create huge number of STEM degree graduates. And one of our requirements is they have to have a minimum of 50% STEM and 20% STEM-related degrees in order for them to become independent university. So we started our process, and we had 2 meetings so far from when we got our mandate by Chairman Parker and yourself, Mr. Chairman. So we had a telephonic meeting on December 22nd and also a meeting at University of Central Florida on January 12th. I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Hitt for allowing for us to have our meeting. Dr. Hitt, thank you so much. Your staff went out of their way to help us with that meeting. When we started our process, and we had a little bit of a blip on our process, and so we got on a conference call. I think that we all made it very clear to each other and made commitment to each other to see to it that this process go through in the most fastest, effective, and efficient way. From that moment on, we have received a tremendous cooperation from University of South Florida. I have received tremendous number of phone calls. They have their own, they set their own committee of handling these transitions. And we have many other committees that work within those 2. So there is a committee from the Board of Governors, and there is a committee from the Board of Trustees. We have received their total commitment from University of South Florida Board of Trustees, independence from the leadership of the university, that they are going to see this thing through. I have received a total commitment from the President Genshaft and her staff that will see this program through. So we had a very effective meeting on January 12th. Our next meeting will be in April. We will have quarterly meeting until hopefully this is done. The only problem that I see, Mr. Chairman and member of the boards, our state no longer can just take no for answer. We want to go forward with our education. The recession, or you can call it a depression that we've been through last few years, and the amount of unemployment. All of us in this room, we sit here, we talk about unemployment, but all of us have jobs. But there are people out there that they don't have jobs, and when they go home, they cannot feed their family. And that is so important to us, for us to be able to take this process forward as fast as possible. The problem that I see is in dealing with SACs, because they have their own process and they take their own time. But we should not take no for answer. We should be able to work with SACs and make sure that this process to go as fast as possible, and we should not take no for an answer. We have to be clear to SACs that we want this to be done. Our state cannot be held to SACs and them deciding maybe this year, maybe next year, maybe 5 years from now, maybe 4 years. It depends. We cannot do that. We have to go as fast as possible. I have received from legislators their support, and they're willing to go to Atlanta with our president, Genshaft, and make sure that that clear to SACS and ask for their cooperation and work with them. And I ask President Genshaft to use all your might to get this process done as fast as possible. As you know, we are going through many different, you can see there is a lot of criteria. And so it's going to take us. The property that we have today is not even built yet. They're finishing the architectural, the plans are going to be ready. So what I like to see that President Genshaft, with the help of our legislators, and hopefully help of SACS to get us to the final point of our board to look at it and says, yes, you're ready to go. And I like for them to come back to us and says, end of 2015, because I think by end of 2015, I think all pieces will come together. So with that, I'd like just to turn it over, Mr. Chairman, to President Genshaft, if she likes to add any comment to that.
I welcome that suggestion. I'd be happy to have any of the legislators or any of you, board staff, anybody that wants to come with us to Atlanta to visit the Southern Association, so that everybody hears the same thing that we're hearing. And if there is any possibility of accelerating the process, we're 100% with that. So again, we will let everyone know when we're going to be going up, and whomever can join us, please do.
Can I just finish? President Genshaft, the legislators and the governor made it very clear to me that they are not looking into having another committee and a committee and a committee. They want result. So I have made a commitment to them on behalf of our committee, on behalf of our board, that we are going to work as fast as possible. We're going to be very active in working with yourself. I was very impressed with your committee that was set up. Mr. Brian Lamb, he made a commitment to me. So I like for us to do this as fast as we can. If we need the help of anybody else, we ought to take it. We ought to be able to look at our children and say we've done our best to create education for you. So I welcome that, and looking forward, I think we will have our next meeting in April.
Oh, thank you. Governor Cross.
I'd just like to comment on the SACS issue. I think it's great that you're going to work hard. It's great that you have a committee. I think it's great that people on the Hill are going to help us. But I just want to remind everybody that unless SACS approves it, you're not going to have too many students wanting to spend that kind of money and effort going to a university program that's not accredited. You're not going to get the quality of staff that's, I'm hoping, is going to be there when this eventually is resolved, unless you have SAC approval. This is a very, very important thing. It's not just people going to an association, Judy, in Atlanta, and you well know, as do all the university presidents, this is a serious thing. It's very, very important, and so I'm assuming you mean also, Maury, that that is a top priority. There are many pieces that have to flow together, and it's great that everybody wants this, and it will happen, but I think that the process has to be clean and clear, and that anyone out there, any student out there who's applying any professor, knows it's an accredited, separate unit. Thank you.
Governor Frost, I absolutely agree with you. It is a top priority, but I also have University of South Florida and a president with the experience that they have, an experience of 11 other universities in this state, so we ought to be able to convince SACS to move faster. It's unacceptable to us. It should be unacceptable to our state that SACS would say, well, all we're going to do is we're going to put one person to read this. So if it takes us 5 years or 9 years or 6 years, well, it's going to take what it's going to take. That should be unacceptable to us. We should convince them. And we should put all the resources that we have to help this process get along faster than it should.
We have an aggressive chair, and I'm all in favor of that. Other comments, questions?
Could I just make one more comment?
Yes, ma'am.
I absolutely understand what you say, Governor Frost, and there will, the SACS, the accreditation is so important because you cannot get financial aid for our students without this kind of accreditation, and you also cannot receive any federal grants of any kind without this accreditation. So it is a very, very, very important accreditation, and they do have a process, and we will go through that process. But if we can accelerate, not in the sense of not having all the pieces there, but if we can accelerate once the pieces get to that office, if we can accelerate the reading of it, and we can have a team together, that be the Southeast East team together, and come out and visit the institution in more of a prompt way, that is what we would try to do. I'm not trying to shortcut any process. I don't think they would allow us to shortcut any process, but we can, is what I understand, accelerate in any way possible. That would be our goal. And it's also to make it clear from them themselves what kind of timeline they see as possible. So they're not hearing it from me, they're hearing it from SACS.
Thank you, President Gitcheff. John, Governor Temple?
Yeah, Dean, I have some questions and comments about STEM. I don't know, and it's not related to Polytechnic, but I'd like to make them before we adjourn, so I don't know whether it's appropriate now.
Let's finish this, and then we're going to have 10 minutes at the end to have some free discussion. Anything further? Okay, thank you very much, Maury. Thank you, Governor Beard and Governor Tripp, for working so hard on this. This is very important to all of us. Governor Perez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Budget Committee, I know we got off easy this week. We didn't meet. I think first time in 6 years that we didn't meet. However, our Budget Committee meeting is set for the University of Central Florida on February 21st. I want to remind you that we're going to be reviewing 6 new fee proposals and 1 amendment to an existing fee proposal. We've got 2 new fees from FAMU, 1 from UWF, 1 from UF, 1 from UNF, 1 from USF, and a fee increase from UWF, all of which we'll review that day. We're going to start at 10 o'clock in the morning on the 21st at UCF. Thank you, President Hitch, for hosting us. Hopefully we'll be done by about 2 o'clock. The plan is to do what we did last time, which is give each university a half an hour to present their fee. We've requested that each university bring a student with them to help in that communication and in that presentation. So there'll be a half an hour presentation, which will include questions by the committee. It should be interesting and lively, just like last time. So February 21st, University of Central Florida, 10 a.m. We're still finalizing all of the fee proposal information. Members of the Budget Committee will get it to you in advance of the meeting, so you'll certainly have a chance to take a look at some of these fees. Some are, once again, very interesting. So we'll look forward to that meeting.
Thank you, Governor Perez. It's 20 minutes before we're supposed to be done, which I'd like to do at all of our board meetings, finish a little bit early and leave time for a little bit of dialogue. So if anybody's got anything in mind, and I'm going to start with John Temple.
Thank you. We've all concentrated on the STEM issue, and I know that Presidents Machen and Barron, I guess, made a presentation. We talked a little bit about it last night to one of the legislative committees, or I don't know who it was. And they brought up a couple of interesting things. One, it's kind of my understanding that our problem with having more STEM is money. I mean, we need more instructors, we need more professors, but we probably have fairly adequate facilities. Now, if I got that wrong, you can correct me. They brought up kind of two issues, broad issues. One is bright futures, whether there ought to be some kind of a allocation of people that go into STEM. I think, Eric, you said maybe you should give them a bonus at the end if they graduate. I mean, there's a lot of things I think we should talk about, and I know the legislature is already focusing on this. I think this board should be, and I don't know how we do this, Dean, but I think this board should have talked about maybe some of these things before and had a position on this going into the legislature. Maybe you do, and if you do, that's good, but I don't remember having a discussion about this. The second thing is whether between majors that we're not particularly interested in, even if they make money, to provide some kind of an incentive for students to go into engineering and sciences and math and STEM type projects. So I don't know how we're going to do this time-wise, but I'm hoping that when you go in and deal with the legislature, that we have some kind of positions on this and see if we can get more STEM out of what we already have.
I've been very careful on dealing with Bright Futures with the legislature. They're very territorial about Bright Futures, and
well, it doesn't mean we can't make a recommendation.
yeah, and although I
and
have,
this board ought to have a discussion about it. I guess is what I'm saying.
and I've generally found that more good things happen and changes in Bright Futures if they think it's their idea than if they think it's our idea. So I do talk to the legislative leadership about this. I think these are all good ideas, and I think probably we ought to talk about it. It's a tough issue because it's a very politically charged issue, but it is being discussed this year in various levels of the legislature, and I encourage that discussion. I think it's a positive discussion, and so I think they'll come back to us with ideas, and I'll be sure to share them with everybody and get your all's input, and if need be, have an emergency telephone call.
Okay.
Okay. Kevin Long.
Thank you. It's actually a good transition. Something I wanted to talk about was college affordability. This has come up a lot today, I think, in Mr. Kreis's presentation from the HECC. He talked about limiting financial aid a little bit when it came to Bright Futures, FRAG, and state financial aid. He talked about doing that by putting more restrictions on graduation requirements past 120 credit hours. One of those restrictions was to limit dual enrollment, to add dual enrollment into the 120 credit hours. As a student who did dual enrollment in high school, I can tell you that you're not exactly planning where your education goes when you're 17, 18-year-old senior in high school. So just want to keep that, wanted to start that dialogue as sort of an introduction to this conversation. I think this board needs to have a serious talk about tuition. I know, Chairman Colson, that is something you are expecting to have happen, but I can tell you students all across the state, this is the biggest issue on our mind. And when we're thinking about the overall cost of education, when you think about tuition, when you think about fees, and when you think about Bright Futures, it is a big issue. When you have students coming to the Board of Governors meeting and having protests, it has to come to my attention. I think it needs to come to the board's attention. So I'd like for us to have some preliminary talks about tuition before we go ahead and assume it. And when I hear comments being made that maybe we should pay for facilities with tuition increases as a response to the PICO issue, that's something that's very concerning to me. So I just wanted to mention that. As far as your remarks on financial aid to help support those students who can't afford it when we're looking at tuition increases, I greatly appreciate that. And I'm glad that is on your mind, and I think that is one of the solutions we need to take very seriously. So thank you for your remarks and your leadership on the board, and looking forward to this year.
Great. Other questions? Other comments? Presidents? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'd just like to
pay a compliment to Representative Proctor for holding these conversations with the presidents of the state universities. We've all experienced it, and I'll tell you, it was very pleasant yesterday. I think we are being listened to. We're being asked real questions. I just think it's one of the best things that has happened in the legislature for higher education. The committee's members were there. They were engaged. They listened. The press was there. They're asking sort of interesting questions, not just finding a way to make a story, but listening to our suggestions. And they're different, because we're all different, but they kind of got a good snapshot of all of us. And I just think it's a great thing, and I wanted to commend Representative Proctor. I wanted to commend the legislature for doing that. It's long overdue, and I think we all kind of enjoyed it. So hats off to Representative Proctor.
I echo that. I don't know a better argument against term limits than the fact that we could lose Representative Proctor. That it is a resource and a gem for higher education, then we're going to lose him in a year.
Well, I was really thinking that the Board of Governors might consider some way to incorporate him as we move forward in higher education. I don't know how, but you're right. I hate to lose that. He's so respected. The legislature listens to him. The members are concerned that he is being termed out. They don't want him to go either.
I know.
But anyway, you're right.
Well, you have him, and then you have this wonderful talent in Lynn Cobb over there that has been there for so many years. So these are resources that are important to higher education in the state. So I agree with you. Anybody else? If we go over, it's your fault.
This is a kind of different question, and it's more of, I guess, a chancellor question. Since I don't get to talk to the chancellor as much as I used to. Right. I know that we suffered, lots of budget cuts and staff cuts and kind of worked through that, but I also know we lost Dottie. And I'm just interested in kind of knowing what your plans are and where you may be. And the reason I wanted to talk about it is I know at one point the board, lots of members of the board had thoughts about, well, maybe we should incorporate a vice chancellor with some healthcare experience. And that was something that was a big deal. I'm not sure if that's still something that folks would like to have, but I think that it's good for us to have an idea of what you have in mind, Frank, and how you can kind of see building out your staff, what your plans are for Dottie's position and or beyond.
Yep. For those in the audience, Dottie Manier was one of our academic leaders who was taken hostage by the University of West Florida's so we lost her to UWF. The good news is we've still got her because she's at UWF. But yes, we have, as most of you know, for a state and a system our size, an incredibly small staff, and therefore people more often than not don't only do double duty, they do multiple duty to meet the needs of the things that you see light up on that screen along with our folks at our universities. We are right now, we have posted for and are actually ferreting through and interviewing people for a position of Chief Academic Officer and looking at some very talented people who have bubbled up through the process to see if in fact we can find someone to come in and help coordinate our effort. It doesn't increase the size of our staff, but to your point, I think, I almost said Madam Chair. To your point, Madam used to be Chair, the overall makeup of that individual is going to be important because whoever steps into that role has to be somewhat knowledgeable about everything we do. Well, you hear how much we do. That takes a remarkable talent. And so hopefully in the very near future we'll be able to find someone who can step into that role, and if they've had that experience as to how to help coordinate the effort on the health side, because we all know what a massive part of the equation health is in the state university system in Florida, that would be a wonderful attribute to have. So this session going in, we're going to try to hang on because I know as we all face budget cuts, and we did it last year, one of the things we face is what's the state university system's share of the cut going to be? And for a system that was at once 140, I think, that is now down to 45, and that includes everybody, from IT people to people who answer the telephones. We're fighting to hang on to what we have. We've got this unique opportunity made necessary because we lost Dottie, but therefore an opportunity to find someone. We're going to try to make the best of it and see if we can find somebody who can help carry this burden.
Thank you. Governor Hussaini.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I listened to you early this morning on your comment, and I want to commend you for it. Sometimes it's not easy not to be liked by everyone. We're trying to be liked by everyone. And all of us here that's sitting here and giving our time to our state, we want to make a difference. We would not be here if we didn't want to make a difference. To me, our Board of Trustees bring invaluable service to our universities. So by no means that, and we also appoint half of those board members. With that said, sometimes our board, and I think that's what we're here for, have to make some tough decisions. Sometimes we have to make a decision and say we want to go to a specific university, that they have a strength in area, we want to make sure we can help him grow and do better and get to where they want to get, and not worry about the rest of the universities if one going to get mad of us. I can't imagine Judy Benz gets mad of me. That's going to kill me. But sometimes you have to make hard decisions if we want to have quality for our education and be able to do what's good at the end of the day, not for us, not for the university presidents, not for Board of Trustees, not for the legislators, but the kids, our students of the state of Florida. At the end of the day, we work for them, and we have to do everything we can, and don't let anything else interfere for us being able to make that delivery. So I'm with you, Mr. Chairman. I really like to see us, this board, to take some tough decisions, if necessary, and go forward. And at the end of the day, to see we've been able to work with our partners, the Board of Trustees, and our leaders, university presidents, to deliver a great education to our state.
Thank you, Governor Hussaini, and I agree with you. Governor Perez.
I just want to thank you for the book, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Well, let me tell you about the book. When I was, there was a tradition at the University of Miami Board of Trustees that the chair would give a small gift to each trustee.
At every meeting?
At every meeting.
We like that tradition.
But not telephonic meetings. Now, that was a more expensive proposition at Miami because there was 80 trustees. And so, but I thought, I know. No, you divide and separate. Your presidents can handle 80 easier than they can handle 8. So I decided just to start that, to do something. And so I'm a George Washington fan. So I read, I remember reading Joseph Ellis's biography of him years ago, and I was impressed by him. And Ron Chernow is a great historian. He's written a lot of good books, and I'm about halfway through this. And it's an important historic work. And I thought, well, this would be a nice first gift. So enjoy. Having said that, if nothing further on the agenda, meeting adjourned. Thank you all.